Hey everyone, it's Megan here from Meghan Makes Do, and today I want to give you some tips for working with Lion Brand Chenille Appeal yarn. This is a lightweight chenille yarn, so there's a core thread running through it, and then there's a bunch of the fuzzy chenille pieces that are woven into that core thread. So it gives it a nice fuzzy texture, kind of creates like a solid looking fabric here where the stitches are not super defined, nor are the rows, which can make it a little bit trickier to work with. So I wanted to share some tips for how to handle that and what to do when you're working with chenille yarn. Okay, so my first tip is keeping track of your stitches, because as you can see, especially when you're crocheting with this type of yarn, you kind of lose your stitches. They're not as easy to see. We can kind of see the little V's that form on the top, but they can be a little bit tricky to keep track of. So what I like to do is when I start a new row and I work my first stitch, I will put a stitch marker into that first stitch so I know where my next row will end. And then I can kind of feel my stitches to help me figure out where to place my hook. Another thing to do is if you kind of stretch it out a little bit, you'll start to see little spaces here. I know it can be kind of hard to see here with my background, but if you hold it up to the light, and just tug a little bit, you'll see the little holes where you need to place your hook, and then you'll see where your stitches are. Another thing that can be helpful is not every row, but every few rows, I would count your stitches as you go just to make sure that you're getting the right number of stitches. I know when I was working with it for my Jordie cardigan, my first panel, I ended up adding a couple stitches in there on accident, and so I had to frog back a couple rows because I wasn't keeping track. But I'm going to go ahead and finish this row, and then I'll show you what happens when we get to this first stitch here. Okay, so we've gotten to the second to last stitch, and now I'm back to this stitch marker. I've also placed a stitch marker again in the first stitch of that previous row, of the row that I'm on. And now I know where to work my last stitch. So I can take that stitch marker out. And it's just an easy way so you keep track of where the start and stop of your rows are. So again, we chain one turn, and when we start our next row, we can just take that same stitch marker and place it in the first stitch. And then as we work across, we know that we already have a stitch marker in the first stitch of the previous row, and this just is an easy way to keep track of where your rows start and stop and helps you more easily count your stitches. So again, when trying to find your stitches, you can somewhat feel them with your fingers where the little spaces are, but again, just give it a little tug and look for the little holes, and that's where you place your hook. Now when it comes to counting your rows, because as you can see here, the fuzzy yarn makes it very hard to see where my rows are. I highly recommend picking up some row counters. These come in handy so much. I use these all the time when using this type of yarn. And so you can just keep track at the end of every row. You just simply turn the dial and keep track by counting up how many rows you have done. This stitch counter I got from Amazon. I will put a link in the description below. This one only goes up to 99. So if you have more than 100 rows, which you will if you do the Jordie or the Jordie cardigan that uses Chenille Appeal yarn, what I did was I just kind of knew, okay, I got to 100 and I started back over again, just knowing that I was that far in my project. But I believe that you can also find row counters or stitch counters that have 3 numbers across. So I will try to find a variety of things and put them in the description below. But these are great for keeping track of your progress and your rows with any kind of fuzzy yarn like this, where your rows kind of disappear on you. Another thing that can be kind of tricky when working with this chenille yarn is joining new pieces of yarn. I do recommend trying your best to only join yarns at the end of rows, especially if you are working up with a knit, on a knit project, and then just taking the extra ends, tying a little knot, and then weaving them into the seams when you're done, because there's a little bit extra material there to help weave the ends into, versus trying to weave it into your actual project where little ends might poke through. Or another method that I find actually doesn't work too bad, as long as you're okay with putting knots in your yarn, is using the magic knot method, which is where you lay your two strands of yarn together like this. Okay, so we're just going to take this end and we're going to tie it to itself, but around this strand of yarn, just like that. And then we're going to take this strand, wrap it around, again tie it to itself, but around the other strand. Make sure to pull tight. And then when we gently pull them together, it's going to create a very tight, secure knot right there. And then we can just trim off the ends as close to the knot as possible. And we'll have a very strong, sturdy join right there. You will have a bit of a knot there, and it might show a little bit, but more than likely because of the makeup of the chenille yarn, when you go to crochet with it, the knot will just blend in nicely. So if you have to join in the middle of a row, I recommend this method, or you can just simply join as you normally would and weave your ends in. Okay, so another thing to think about when working with chenille yarn is seaming. So I like to use a large blunt tapestry needle to seam. I found that this works well for me, but something I did notice as I was weaving, especially longer panels together, is that my yarn would start piling up. So basically there's a core thread in this yarn, and here we can take off some of the fuzziness, and all of the little chenille pieces are kind of woven into this core thread here. So as you can see, it's a thin thread, and then there's all these chenille pieces kind of woven in between the strands of the thread. And what would happen is these would kind of bunch up, and I would have little clumps together and then bare thread exposed, and then it would make it more difficult to pull my yarn through. So if this starts happening to you and you start getting bunches in your yarn and it's just too hard to use a needle and the yarn, what you can do is use your crochet hook and you can slip stitch your seams together. So here I have two pieces, and when I'm slip stitching, you can either go through both sides of each stitch on each panel, or you can try to just go through the back loop on one panel and the front loop on the other, and then you just slip stitch them together. So it's going to give you a little bit thicker of a seam on the inside, but actually I find that that helps for when you're weaving in ends. It gives you a little bit more room, a little bit more material to weave into. So we'll have all of this right here to help weave our strands into at the end. So again, I prefer using a tapestry needle and the yarn to seam, but as I said, if it gets bunchy on you, you can just slip stitch those seams together and it still looks great on the other side. Because this yarn is so forgiving with the fuzziness, it almost becomes completely invisible. Okay, so my last tip for you is on actually weaving in those ends. So you can usually just use the same method that you normally would. Again, I like to use a blunt tapestry needle for initially weaving in ends, and then a smaller tapestry needle for really getting in there and securing it in place. So if we're using a tapestry needle, we can just kind of find the little strands and weave our end in as best as we can, like this, trying to stay somewhat loose so we don't bunch up our fabric, and the yarn just kind of disappears in place. I like to kind of zigzag back and forth a few times, so I'll go back and go through. The only downside I find when weaving in ends with this type of yarn is because the yarn, the nature of the yarn is it's just these chenille pieces on a core thread, you don't have those strands that you can kind of get your woven in ends into, weave it back in through the other strands of yarn. So another tip and another thing that you can do with the chenille yarn is after you've woven in your ends a few times back and forth, if you're worried about them popping out, which sometimes that happens, you may see like a little end, a little nub poke through, is as long as you are leaving a long enough tail on your yarn, is once you've woven it in, you normally would cut off here, but what you can do is pull the chenille out of the thread so that you're exposing just the core thread that's left behind. And I'm going to take this all the way down as close to my end as possible. It can get a little hard to do. You kind of have to pull each little piece out on its own to get it all the way out of the thread. So just continue pulling out the little chenille pieces until you have quite a long piece of just the core thread left. So I'm going to kind of take it down to about here. Okay, so now that I've gotten most of the chenille part off of the core thread and I'm pretty close to the end here, I'm going to use a more sharp needle for this and thread that core thread onto the needle. And then what I can do is I'm going to weave this end in and out and kind of sew it into place. The thread will actually kind of disappear into the chenille fabric. And so what I can do is, now that I just really have the thread left, I know that I've been told before that there shouldn't be any knots in your work, but I'm going to go ahead and tie some knots here with that core thread around some of the other strands in the fabric. And this is just going to ensure that my end is not going to come out. And then I can kind of weave the core thread in a few times to the fabric. And again, it's just going to disappear because of all the chenille pieces around it. You shouldn't really see too much of it. Oh, I guess I didn't weave that in well enough there. You can kind of see it. So you may see like a tiny little bit of the thread, but tying that knot of that end in place is going to just add a little bit of extra security to weaving in your ends. And when you feel like you've gotten it secure enough, you're just going to trim it as close to the fabric as possible. And that way you know that your end is secure and it's not going to come undone. So that's a tip for just when you're done, you're finishing your project, you're weaving in those ends. I like to weave it in as normal strip down to the core thread, or alternatively, you can also just pick up a matching thread, regular sewing thread that matches this, and do the same kind of thing. Just kind of tie some knots around the end of your chenille yarn and then weave it back and forth and tie it into the fabric. That way you know it's not going to come apart. I especially prefer this type of method where you're actually using the core thread or another type of thread to sew it in place, especially if you are going to end up machine washing your piece at all. You want to make sure that before it goes and gets laundered that it is going to not fall apart on you in the wash. So there are some tips for working with the Lion Brand Chenille Appeal yarn. If you want to go ahead and try a project with this yarn, you can check out my Jordie and Jessa cardigans. The Jordie is crochet and the Jessa is knit, and we're currently doing a crochet along with both. So go ahead and check that out in the links in the description below. Thanks for watching. I hope you liked it. Don't forget to subscribe.